battleship. They have numerous heavy cruisers. This is a mismatch of, mythic proportions.
But the commander of one of the small destroyers chooses to stand and make the best showing he can, despite the odds. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, commanding the destroyer USS Johnston, determines to charge the enemy.
He had two choices. He could flight or fight. But what he did is he turned his ship and he actually went and he attacked this Japanese armada.
Which is an act of bravery which almost beggars the imagination.
American destroyers have 5-inch guns, but they also have torpedoes, which is the weapon Evans hopes to bring to bear. Unfortunately, the range of the torpedoes is only 5 miles, half as far as the Japanese force on the horizon.
He had to close his distance. He was at about 10 miles, and he had to get within 5 miles for his torpedoes to be effective, because they were only effective at 5 miles.
Evans orders his little vessel to speed toward the vastly superior Japanese force. He knows the enemy's guns will be firing on him, but he plans to weave to try to avoid the killing rounds. And if he gets close enough, he might just score a lucky hit. Evans's bold charge inspires other commanders around him, and soon many destroyers join the attack.
They go after the Japanese with both gunfire and torpedoes. They're laying smoke screens to try to screen the escort carriers as they're trying to dawdle their way out at 17 or 18 knots.
The escort carriers are also firing their 5-inch guns as they scramble to get dozens of attack planes into the air and avoid being hit by the enemy. The escort carrier planes are Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcats. The Wildcat is the older fighter, but it can still pack a punch.
The Americans very quickly managed to get hundreds of these airplanes up in the air, doing something in the way of harassing the Japanese fleet.
Out in front of the American attack vessels, Lieutenant Commander Evans plows forward trying to get within torpedo range.
He was firing his little 5-inch guns, and they were basically just bouncing off the sides of these big, huge ships that the Japanese had. But he was aiming for the bridge, and he was aiming for the decks and so forth.
Finally in range, Evans unleashes a torpedo at the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. The torpedo courses through the sea, and minutes later,
blew the bow right off the front of a Japanese cruiser.
Soon, the Japanese cruiser Suzuya stops to assist the wounded Kumano.
He fired another torpedo, and he also hit and sunk that ship.
Amid the heavy gunfire, torpedo attacks, and the hundreds of planes harassing them, Admiral Kurita and his commanders are bewildered.
The Japanese are thrown into confusion. They believe that they are being attacked by more powerful forces than they are. You start seeing Japanese cruisers getting knocked out. The Japanese battleships are taking damage to their topsides. It makes it very difficult for the Japanese to fight a coherent action against the Americans. They're constantly maneuvering to avoid air attacks, which in turn makes it difficult to direct the gunfire against the American jeep carriers.
Like a bear under attack by a swarm of bees, the Japanese center force falters.
Where they thought that they had a mismatch, and they really did in terms of raw material terms, they're unable to close with the Americans. They're increasingly harassed by American air power. And eventually, the Japanese admiral decides that he's had enough and he leaves.
They said, the hell with this. They turned around and they hightailed it out of there.
They could have sunk every ship that was there, but somehow the admiral there gave orders, turn around, they headed for home.
Which is a stunning reversal, and from the Americans' perspective, a sudden deliverance that they had not expected that they were going to receive.
Unfortunately, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans the bold instigator of the American charge, doesn't survive the battle. Before the center force withdraws, Japanese destroyers close in on Evans's vessel and riddle it with gunfire. The USS Johnston sinks, and Lieutenant Commander Evans is never seen again. The Battle of Leyte Gulf has ended in utter disaster for the Japanese Navy. The Japanese losses at Leyte include 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and nearly 14,000 sailors and air crewmen. American losses, by contrast, are relatively light. 1 light aircraft carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 2 destroyer escorts, and 1,500 sailors and air crewmen.
This really marks the final demise of the Japanese Navy, and they'll never really be able to do anything of concerted nature to repel any further attacks by the U.S. Navy at this point. It really is the end of an era.
The U.S. Navy has now eclipsed the force that started a mode of warfare, carrier warfare, whose supreme potential no one had recognized before December 7th, 1941.
No one knew how carriers were supposed to operate. Pearl Harbor really was the initial battle that sort of announced the beginning of the carrier age warfare. Leyte is the battle that announces that there's only one Navy in the world that is really capable of doing that sort of warfare, and it's the U.S. Navy.
The Battle of Leyte Gulf has another preeminent distinction. It is the largest naval confrontation in the history of mankind.
A naval battle beyond comprehension in terms of its overall scale and size. And right there in the middle of it is the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. That ship, which early in the war was there to hold the line against the Japanese. The same ship that, for a while, was the only aircraft carrier we had in the Pacific.
USS Enterprise is the only American carrier to have engaged all 3 of the Japanese attack forces. And for one Enterprise pilot, the struggle at Leyte lasts a few days longer than it does for his fellow flyers. Commander Fred Backetus, the Enterprise Hellcat pilot shot down in the Sulu Sea on the morning of the 24th, remains adrift for 6 more days.
In the middle of the night, Backetus is asleep. He wakes up to the sound of diesel engines. It's a very chilling experience. Could be the Japanese fleet, could be an enemy picket boat or a Japanese destroyer. In a moment, he could be taken aboard, taken prisoner. Turns out, it's the USS Hardhead. It's an American submarine, and it's come to his rescue.
USS Hardhead later transfers Backetus to another sub headed for Perth, Australia. From there, Backetus flies back to Pearl Harbor and eventually rejoins his squadron. The Navy needs fighter pilots like Backetus. The war is drawing to a close. And with the loss of their carrier forces, the Japanese must now resort to launching suicide attacks from land bases. The kamikaze will present the gravest threat to the U.S. Navy of the entire war. And for USS Enterprise, the kamikaze, the divine wind, will mean catastrophe.